This show is listener supported. You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is Season 4, Episode 6, Anne and Ryan. I'm your host, Haley Radke. Today, you are invited into a conversation between Anne Heffron and her ex-husband, Ryan Iwanaga. They tell us about their marriage, the things that pulled them apart, and we talk about what they've done since their divorce in order to co-parent well and have a peaceful relationship as friends. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to all of the things we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Stick around until the very end to find out how you can take a Ride or Die class with Anne and yours truly. Let's listen in. Well, I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On today two guests, one returning, Anne Heffron, of course. Welcome back, Anne.
Hi, Haley. Thank you.
And a special guest Anne has invited to come on is Anne's first husband, her ex-husband, Ryan Iwanaga. Welcome, Ryan.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah.
It's like I feel like music should be playing. Dun dun dun.
A drum roll, please.
Yeah.
Well, I asked Anne on the show because we're talking about relationships this season, and I wanted to touch on the topic of divorce. And it's not something we talk about very often. And I think it's very common for adopted people to get divorced, just as it is for the rest of the population. But I think being adopted adds an extra layer. And I asked Anne, and she said, well, wait, can I ask Ryan to come on with me so we can talk about this together? And I was like, cool. So I'm so pleased and honored that you would come and discuss this with us. Really, I'm really excited to talk with you too.
Thank you very much.
Ryan, I'm going to ask you to start. Can you tell us, how did you meet Anne?
Anne and I met in the fall of, I want to say 1992. And we were both first-year students at the Master of Fine Arts program for creative writing at the University of Oregon. She was a fiction writer and I was a poet. And it was a fairly small overall class size. She had, I believe, 5 or 6 students, and I had 6 students on my side. And it was because of the size of it, we were always kind of hanging out and together. And really, I think we started off as friends first, and basically it just sort of developed from there. And we started really, I think, dating and being serious at the middle of our first year. And then we got married in the summer or the fall of 1994. That's how we met, right, Anne?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I tell a story?
Okay.
Right. Remember, so early in the semester, our teacher told us what his teacher had told him to do for writer's block, and he told him to stay up all night and write. So Ryan and this other fiction writer, Erda, and I decided we were going to get a motel room by the shore in Oregon and stay up all night and write. So of course we did everything but write, and we went exploring, and it was nighttime, and we went to go see the shore, and we were standing by this lighthouse, and I was standing there, and Ryan and I weren't a couple yet, and he came up behind me and he said something like, "You look like you're longing for something." I felt so seen by him, but the irony was that that longing is I didn't know what that longing was. I just lived with that longing, and that longing later would be the thing that also split us apart. But at the time, I thought that he was really insightful. And then we went back to the motel, and did we get kicked out? Did that guy kick us out?
No, I think we had paid for 2 people.
Oh, yeah.
And then they realized that there were 3 of us, so they knocked on the door and we had to pay an extra $10.
three of us are there with our typewriter. Or no, we
Yeah.
had really old computers, right? The first computers. I think they thought there was going to be a party in the room. And all
Yeah.
we had was like Cheetos and room spray because Erda kept farting, I think. Right? And I think
Yeah.
I
Something
was
like
like,
that.
what are you guys doing?
Yeah.
That was awesome.
But that was a good trip though. I mean,
That was,
it
was
was
great.
excellent.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, we didn't get much writing done, but that was when we got together, when we came
Yeah.
home from that.
So tell me, how long were you married? And then you have a daughter together.
Yes, we were married about 7 years, and we have a 20-year-old daughter. Name is
What's
Keats.
21?
Oh, 20. Oh, excuse me. She just turned 21. That's right. She's an adult now.
Yes.
We were fortunate enough to have a wonderful daughter. And I think, yeah, so she was 4 years old. So we had been married because I think yeah, 7 years total, I think, right, Anne?
Yeah, 7.
Anne has shared her story on the show before. And I don't want to speak for you, Anne. I'm just going to give a little summary that it's only been in the last couple years that you've really discovered adoption has had an impact on your life. And you've kind of uncovered some adoption grief and trauma and those kind of things. So we've talked about that before. And so when we're talking about the time period that you and Ryan were married, none of that was in your conscious mind, right?
Right, never.
You just alluded to that when you were telling this story, this faraway look in your eye and that. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I was thinking about it before this call, and I was thinking about how it could have been easier for Ryan if I'd known who I was and what I was going through. And I realized that there were some key moments, like the first time there was a time early in the relationship where Ryan said something like he needed more space, or like he just wanted to back off a little bit. You know, like a normal thing that someone would say after the intensity of the beginning of a relationship. But I did that thing that a lot of adopted people do, where I went into that spiral of I'm going to lose him. And I remember I had the keys to his apartment, so I went into his apartment and I put on the cure and I lay in a fetal position on the ground. I mean, it was fetal, right? Like now it's so obvious. And I prepared to die basically. And he came home and he's like, I don't like the cure. But you know, what's he supposed to do? I kind of trapped him. Right?
No.
It's like, okay, so we can't, this won't work because you're so heartbroken. So okay, let's go back to spending all this time so it wasn't normal. And if I had known, okay, adopted people have a really hard time with any kind of separation, we could have had a healthier start from the begin. Like that attachment disorder is tricky because it looked like I was attaching, but I was attaching, but I was also attaching with fear instead of with this grounded sense of this is who I am. I love myself. Ryan is another person, and we are developing a relationship.
Could I go on the record just to say, like, it wasn't as if I was like this self-realized spiritual kind of centered human being. When I think about our relationship and I think about the divorce, I don't think about it in terms of, okay, well, if Anne was in a better place, then things would have worked out differently. You know, I had just as much a part of kind of how things played out because I was battling my own demons. You know, I was trying to figure out who I was, and I don't want to sound trite, or I don't want to try to make the divorce kind of like this winning situation where it was a really, really difficult time for both of us individually and as a couple. But I think that by us kind of dealing with the heartbreak and the difficulty and the emotional kind of consequence of the divorce, it both kind of actually led us on a certain individual path of discovery, some by mistake, but some really deliberate kind of trying to figure out who we were. And certainly the people, the perspective that we have on the relationship today while we were in it, both of us kind of lacked the maturity and the self-confident, like just as Anne was dealing with this idea of detachment and losing and whatever, I was sort of dealing it in my own way, in my own terms. And so I was just as limited as a partner in that it wasn't as if it was just one-sided. I contributed just as much to how things played out, the dysfunction of the relationship. And it wasn't until much later that I think we both kind of looked back and we realized, okay, we took ownership of whatever was happening. And I think so much of divorce can kind of fall into this blame game. And there's this lack of responsibility and ownership by each individual. And I think that's what's really made me feel good. Well, I don't want to say good, but if there's anything as a result of the divorce, it's been that Anne and I have been able to, along with my my second wife, we've been able to raise a great kid who knows that all of her parents love her. We've never really sucked her into the drama, and she's always, we've always parented her equally with big hearts. And Anne, actually, I have a 5-year-old with my second wife, and Anne is a very big part of his life. She's actually one of his favorite people, and I think to me that's really kind of special. But also, what I want to say is, even though Anne didn't know, I have always known that the melancholy or the sadness that exists within her is as a result of that, of the adoption. But as someone who's not adopted, it's kind of hard. I was always trying to figure out how to support that sadness, and I lack the necessary tools to be able to understand it, first of all, and to know how to basically help Anne with it, because it was just something that I could never understand.
Can you just say a little bit more about that, Ryan? How did you know that this was something that she was lacking? Like, did you have experience with adoption? Did you ever talk about just the fact that she was adopted, any of that?
It wasn't anything that she kept hidden. I think there were times when we talked about it, and I could just tell, and maybe I was wrong, but I just kind of feel like I always knew that the thing that she felt like she was missing was that the gap, or what, I don't even know how to describe it, but was the loss of the whole process of adoption, and kind of having this, okay, well, where do I belong, and where do my roots exist, and like how do I identify myself with my present family. And I mean, I would always put myself in her place. I came from a family where my parents were married for 26 years, and I came from a kind of a typical family. My father passed away just before I got to Oregon, or 2 or 3 years before I got to Oregon. I'd come from I don't know if it's stable, but I'd come from a traditional family where my mom and dad were my mom and dad. And so for Anne, I always just felt like, as a writer, I guess, right, you're always thinking about where's the sadness coming from, or where is the deep kind of process of creation coming from, right? That life is so long ago to me, but I remember I always used to think it was part. I was trying to reconcile part of what was disconnected in my life, and that was always the thing that I felt that Anne's project was, as a writer, was trying to make sense of the disconnectedness that she had, not only with her birth mother and father, but actually with her adopted mother and father, because oftentimes her subject had to do with the relationship of the mom and the daughter, and how much she desired to have this deep, deep, deep understanding connection, and how there was that, but it wasn't sort of this organic thing that existed between them.
It's so funny because to hear you talk about it, the Haley, the like the pre-fog, right? And then the fog and then the post-fog. It
Mhm.
is it, I don't remember talking about adoption until I was about 52 or 51, right? And then all of a sudden it was because adoption became this real thing, because I could see how it had hurt me, or how it had affected me. When before it was like this thing I kept reaching for, but I didn't feel the hooks in me. Do you know, like so Rye, when you say that, I remember, but it didn't make any sense. And so my thesis in graduate school was called Guilt. It was GILT, and it was about this actress on a soap opera who had an eating disorder. I mean, I could not write about myself, but I could write about feeling guilty about everything. But I didn't even know to name it the real guilt. Right. So I was writing around my big questions because I didn't feel that I could write about my mom. I think because I had so much buried anger that I didn't know how to cope with that.
Yeah.
Right. So I didn't. So what would happen is that the words would just freeze, and then I would feel like I had nothing to say. But I think that I needed people to push me as far as the writing goes. I needed people would talk. My teachers would talk about form or story, but they didn't look at me, the storyteller, and challenge me and my ideas and who I was. And that's what I needed, someone to really push me to be honest. And I think I was so terrified that I didn't. I remembered, Rye, when we did get divorced, and there was a time when you were angry, and you wrote me a letter and you said I was like a black hole. And that stayed with me for a long time because I felt like a black hole, right? It was like, and I imagined what it was like for you to be with me, because as an adoptee, I've done this thing my whole life where as soon as someone comes in the room, I basically try to not erase myself, but I try to mirror the other person so that I can try to figure out who that person wants me to be so that I'm acceptable, so that they'll like me and stay. And I think our marriage was like a bounce. There were so many wonderful things about our marriage, but it was also a bounce between me doing that to you, like trying to be who I thought you wanted, and then being angry, right? Because I wasn't who I wanted to be, but I didn't know who that was.
Sure.
So it's this catch-22 of like, I didn't really even have any friends, right? So because I didn't know, I looked like a person and I acted like a person, but I don't know where I was,
I think that's the way for most people, right? I can say that I think one of the things that really was the block for Anne was the fact that, talking about, like, there's nothing more sacred than the love a child has for the mother, right? Like, I always tell my wife now, because my son he just loves his mom. Unfortunately, because I know, right? I'm a mama's boy. I grew up with 3 sisters. My dad passed away, so it was just me and my 3 sisters and my mom. So I'm like, my sisters always say, like, I have this weird relationship with my mom because I'm the boy and I'm her favorite, whatever. But I told my wife basically that the struggle that Monroe's going to face is he's going to search the rest of his life for his mom, for the love that he feels for his mom. He has to somehow go out and find it in a partner, whether, man, woman, it doesn't matter. But he's always going to be looking for that deepness of the connection and the bond and the love that he has for his mom. And so I think for Anne as a writer, the reason why she would always get to a point and then not be able to is I think that there was tremendous guilt over kind of having this thing that was always like considered this sacred thing, like the love of parent, or especially the mom, the love of the mother, and how there's this sort of ideal that we're all told, the mother's love is one of the greatest things. And then to have this kind of conflicting emotion over it, and really kind of having to bear the responsibility of, yeah, I love my mom, but I have all these other feelings about it too. Like, and I can't speak for Anne, but there was always, as someone who read her work, there was this it always reached this point to where she was actually going to break this almost taboo to speak, to sort of admit that there was this disconnect between her and her mom. But there was also a fear of, by saying that, she was sort of betraying the bond that she had with her mother. And that's a huge, huge responsibility for someone who's, for anybody, right? But for someone who's trying to write about it, to make the decision to cross that and to take responsibility and to own that, there's so much fear and so much power in that kind of moment. And the reality is that I think once Anne actually owned it and stepped across that, she actually individually became empowered and enlightened and kind of free from the burden of that fear. But when you're in it and you're trying to create and you're trying to say something meaningful, that's a very terrifying place. And so I think Anne was she was in limbo, or she was stuck almost, because she would always circle around that sort of sacred ground and have the guilt of saying, okay, well, or just having the guilt of actually feeling these conflicting feelings. It creates a weird tension that what I feel like has always kind of stayed with her. And like her energy now, since she's written her book and everything, it's much different. Like I'm sure she deals with the same kind of angst, and we all do, but there's a part of her deep inside where she's come to terms with some of the things that I think always burdened her when she was younger. And that energy, I think, has opened her up to new possibilities. I think she has kind of thoughtful intent on a daily basis of, she understands what her voice in her project or her vision or journey or whatever it may be. She kind of has an understanding of that direction, whereas before it was always one step forward, three steps back, because that was a scary place.
Well, let's go back to your 7 years of marriage and having Keats. And so are you guys in your 20s at this point when you're, no, early 30s?
Wait, Haley, can we back up for a second? Can I say,
Yeah.
because Ryan said something that was really insightful, and he was talking about the disconnect between me and my mom. And I think about other adopted people, especially, well, not even just especially women, so many people who write to me and tell me they want to write about things, but they're so afraid of hurting, especially their parents, their adoptive mom in particular. And, I waited until she died to write about her. And it wasn't until, and it was the hardest thing. And when I went to write, I mean, that's why I call this Write or Die, because I thought I would die. To write about my mom in a way to show that there was the gap between us, to say that she is my quote unquote real mom, but at the same time she isn't, is so heartbreaking. And so like deeply, deeply devastating, because it actually challenges my existence. Because if your mom's not your real mom, then you're not real. Right. And my limbic brain, I mean, it panics. And so it's that was the single hardest thing I've ever done in my life, is to acknowledge our relationship for what it was. And I went to the California Adoption Conference, and then there was an adoptive parent there, and we were talking briefly, and we're standing there. We both have tears in our eyes, and I was telling, because it's hard. She has a daughter who's 12, and she can feel it starting. And I said, I wish, if I could have anything, I just wish my mom could have held me, and we could have both cried about the fact that I was adopted. Because then I would have felt like we had a real, real moment. I would have been able to exist for my mom the way real Anne, not the Anne that my mom dreamed up, who didn't come from someplace else. Because in my mom's mind, I came from her. But that made me not me. And so that makes me both feel shameful and furious. And I wish I had been tougher I wish I had known if I had come out of the fog earlier, but her death is what threw me into it, basically, or out of it. I wish I'd had the guts to say, this is what I need. I need you to do this for me, right? Like, you are my mom. I love you so much. And I have another mother, right? I didn't ask for her. I didn't ask to be created this way, but this is how it is. And if you could please just hold me like I'm a baby and rock me and let me sob, because it would, see, I'm going to cry just telling you, because just to have one mom would have been like so great. But that's not what we get. And I think that how can you, as an adopted person, having that kind of mindset, how can you go and have a marriage that, unless you've done a lot of therapy or a lot of work? Because that grief, I was just waiting. I mean, Ryan said he had his own demons. I mean, we picked each other because there was a certain distance between us, and we liked that. That's what we could handle. And Ryan wasn't fully available to me, but that made me feel safe, because if we had been fully available to each other, I would have been so terrified of him leaving. But if we were already slightly disconnected, that made me feel safe.
Mm.
Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that at the conference, I stayed with Leslie Johnson, and she's excited about the brain spotting that she's learned. So she asked me if I wanted to do it. And what you do is you pick a memory that holds, or you pick a belief. And I told her, I still feel like I'm just going to die. And she said, well, okay, let's start. I guess that's an easy one to start with. And the brain spotting is you have an idea that's bothering you, and then she has this pointer, and you follow it with your eyes, and she tracks your vision, and she watches you, but you also watch yourself, and you figure out where in your line of vision that memory is the most triggering. And I could feel it. It was over on my left side. And then you follow the pictures that come to mind. And I saw this picture of when I was young, and this doesn't have to do with dying. It was just what came into my mind of like when I was young, and my parents had put our stuff on the top of the car, and we were driving to the Cape, and my suitcase flew off. And my friend and I got out of the car, and we walked away from the car to go get the suitcase. And, there's a feeling of not being safe. Like, my dad historically didn't fasten things to the car very well, so things fly off. And, you want your stuff to stay. But what I learned in the brain spotting was that I saw that as traumatic. Like, my brain saw this picture of what I saw was the car driving away. And that's not what happened. But what I was able to do was to turn the other direction and see this long open road, and to understand that my life could be that road, right? I could focus on the trauma and feeling not safe, or I could focus on this idea of I have my whole life ahead of me. And somehow that all tied together to the idea that I was going to die, that without my mom, I was going to die. And it was so freeing. And the next night, just something woke me up, and I felt like a 13-year-old. When you suddenly like boys or girls and you could have a relationship. I had that feeling of like, oh my God, I could have a relationship with someone. And I felt euphoric, because I felt like I can be myself. Like, I don't have to hide anymore. Mm. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Ryan and I are here doing this, because it's like both of us have come so far, and now we can just pretty much fearlessly show up, because we're living it's just so basic, right? It's like you're you and I'm me, and there's nothing it's so much easier. Did you want to go back to your question, Haley?
Let's take over this podcast.
Yeah, Haley. Enough about you, Haley.
Yeah.
See, Haley. I'll come back in 20 minutes and we'll wrap it up.
It's like in Beaches. Enough talking about me. Let's talk about you. So, what do you think about me?
Well, I do want to go to something, Anne. So, talking about when you became a mother. So, you're in the middle of your marriage and you have Keats. And how did that change your relationship?
That was a good time. That was wonderful. Ryan wasn't getting his PhD in poetry at Houston, but as soon as my water broke, he went to the typewriter and started typing up his resume because he said he wasn't going to be a dad and live on $10,000 a year.
Yeah.
But it was a sweet time because we were surrounded by these graduate students, and I was only working part-time as a teacher, so I didn't have to work while Keats was a baby, and Ryan would go to class and then come home, and that was lovely. I mean, I don't Ryan, wasn't it just wonderful? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was a simple time. I mean, it was complicated in that all of a sudden there was responsibility and our roles kind of shifted, and it was an interesting time, I think, for me individually, because all of a sudden it wasn't just Anne and I had a responsibility to provide for not only Anne but for my daughter, and it was just a little different. And actually, that was the impetus for me to leave graduate school and academia and come back to California and get into real estate. And I don't regret it at all. I don't regret leaving academia. I think I was just there kind of for lack of any other choice. But it was a nice time in that it was something that the birth of a child, there's nothing greater, right? And so it was just a really cool time for both of us.
You know what I realized? And that also, when when you have a child, all of a sudden you can't focus on yourself.
Yeah.
So maybe any adoption drama that it was just dropped because I was taking care of somebody.
I can say this though, from the perspective of kind of like, I think for Anne, well, it's probably like this for any mother, but just it seemed like in that moment, like for the first time in Anne's life, she had something that actually was like she was biologically connected to. And I think that from the very beginning, she was determined to be kind of there was a fierceness. I don't mean like fierceness isn't just like, aggressive, but there was just this determination for her to make sure that she was connected to Keats. And there was a commitment to it that I had never seen from her. Usually Anne was really happy-go-lucky, but when it came to Keats, there was this earnestness and a seriousness. And I think we've talked about it before, that was really the first time in her life that she actually had a tangible representation of sort of who she was, and there wasn't this disconnect of having adopted parents. Like Keats was hers. And in fact, I think the hardest part for her, and I don't mean to laugh, but I remember like we were in Houston, Texas, and I'm a fourth generation Japanese American. Like my great grandfather came over in 1890. Like we've been in California for over a century, but people in Houston always used to say, "Gosh, I can't hear your accent. Where are you from?" And it's in Houston, people, Estonians were fantastic people, but just every once in a while, right? They just aren't used to native, especially Asians. But Anne came home from the hospital, or not from the hospital, from the supermarket one day, just in utter tears, just so emotional. And it was because when she was shopping, someone asked her, "Where did you get your baby?" And because Keats had dark hair, she looked Asian when she was younger. She's definitely a Hapa, half and half, you could tell. But at that time, she had really dark hair. She looked like an Asian baby. And it just wrecked Anne to have someone ask such a silly question, because in her mind, that was really the first representation of herself, right? It was what she had been missing all her life. And she came home, and I just remember do you remember that?
It makes me cry now. I didn't
Yeah.
remember it, but it makes me feel awful.
It was a horrible thing to say, and And of course, there was no ill will behind it. It was just sort of someone being super naive and not really thoughtful. But I just remember thinking, wow, that was kind of a heavy thing. Like,
And it happened a lot.
yeah, yeah. And I think it really wounded Anne because of the stuff that we had talked about. And she had finally created some type of a root and a tangible representation of herself, and she was creating a history that she hadn't had, and that's what I kind of remember.
I think you wrote about that in your book, didn't you, Anne?
I did, because I finally came up with an answer that I liked, and people would say, "Where did you get her?" And I would say, "I pushed really hard and she came out."
I love it.
And so it was good to be able to laugh, because there's that loss of breath moment where it's like, oh, crud,
Right.
even this isn't mine. When you were talking, Ryan, I was thinking about how that fierceness, because I do feel that. And I think that would have been another thing that if for younger couples now, if one of them is adopted, it's a good time to go into counseling when you have a child, because I think that I focused more on Keats than on you, which I know that is a thing that mothers do, but they're also that fear of loss and separation. I'm back to listening to The Cure on your floor, right?
Mhm.
Like, I remember when you said to me, it's time to get a job, right? And I remember just looking at you like, okay, you're insane, because I can't leave this child. And I think it would have been helpful and we even went to therapy. And I remember the therapist saying, well, why don't you get a job? And there was a couple of things going on. One was that I had the whole kind of self-esteem thing where I had zero, and I couldn't explain to her that I didn't even exist enough to get a job. And so I just got super sweaty, but also I identified so completely as Keats's mom. That was the first role that I stepped into 100%.
Yeah.
That I couldn't challenge it because I didn't exist.
Maybe that's what it was. It was the intensity of it. Like, she was 100% in, and I had never seen that before. For Anne, she always had a plan B. In everything that she did, there was always kind of this escape plan that she would have. And for the first time, like, I think with Keats, there wasn't anything. She was completely committed and 100% like. And then after a while, I think when we started to have challenges in our relationship, she, in order to kind of deal with whatever disconnectedness or dysfunction we shared, she would become more focused on Keats. Like, Keats, it allowed her to grow the safety distance, or the distance that she needed from me in order to cope with our relationship. And so, as a father, there was always this really delicate, and as much as we kind of didn't intend it to be, we became more the traditional couple where she was at home and she was the mom, and she was the kind of quote unquote homemaker, and I was the guy out working and whatever. And so, actually, when things were really rough for us, I always felt like I was coming in as an outsider in the relationship, because Keats and her had this special bond. And I wasn't, at that time, I really wasn't equipped to be like a thoughtful father. And I just emotionally, just maturity wise, I wasn't really, I didn't know how to negotiate it. Plus, I think I lacked the basic skills just to be a patient father to begin with. And so there was this weird kind of like, I would come home and I would feel like kind of a outsider to whatever specialness that they had, right? And but looking back, it was just the only sure thing that Anne had was Keats. And so it makes sense that she would focus on the child and sort of protect herself from me and kind of whatever our relationship had become.
So what happened when you guys went to therapy, and what were you trying to work on, and what ultimately happened?
Yeah, we went to therapy a little bit late in the game. We had been distant for a really long time. We both were not in a good place. And I think, as I remember it, I came home from work late one night and I just asked her what's wrong. And she just said, I don't want to be married to you anymore. And that was kind of it. Like, and my part in the whole thing and my problem in the whole thing is it actually sort of came as a shock. Whereas, like, that's sort of my responsibility. Like, for the fact that I was actually shocked that she didn't want to be married to me is an indication of how much in denial I was, and that was part of the problem. And so I packed my, it was just really tough. I remember, I think I packed my bag, showed up. I was like Felix Unger showing up at Oscars, except it was my mom's house. It's down the block. And I just said, hey, I just been kicked out. I think, we're going through some tough times, whatever. And then I don't know, it was just a really kind of hazy time. But then someone suggested we go and meet with a marriage counselor. And then that's when we started, but it was already broken. Anne was really super angry at me. I was super angry at her. And there was so much that we had not actually dealt with in the relationship that it was kind of like at a point of, we were just stuck, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just, I think, I do believe that everything happens for a reason. And I do believe that Mina is perfect for you. And if we hadn't gotten divorced, you guys wouldn't have gotten married and Monroe wouldn't exist. So I do think, I'm so glad I was married to you, and I'm so glad that we had Keats. But I think as a learning experience for other people, if Beth, our therapist, if she had been adoption competent or adopting or known anything, or even asked one of us, like, because so much, and I realized that we had gone too late, but there were earlier things like when in my mind, our marriage fell apart when I had a miscarriage.
Mm,
And it wasn't until just recently I realized, for an adopted person to have a miscarriage, that's really complicated,
yeah.
right? Because you're losing a baby. But I didn't even have the language for it.
Yeah.
And so I just had feelings. And what happened was my heart closed to Ryan. But it wasn't about Ryan, right? It was about, I didn't know where to put my anger and my heartbreak. So I put it on the first person, the person who was closest to me. And I can't encourage couples enough where one or both are adopted to have basically a therapist on call, like an adoption competent therapist. And if you don't know where to get one, that Jacinia Palmer has that on I Am Adopted on Twitter. She has a list of adoption competent therapists, adoptee competent therapists. So although there aren't enough, there are some. And I also think that, just going back a little bit, Rye, what you were saying about when you would come home and feel left out, I think because of the way I behave as an adopted person, that I needed Keats to love me. And so that put you in the role always as the hard guy. I was never going to risk making her angry. She and I don't know if we've ever had a fight. Oh no, maybe once or maybe twice. And I'm still negotiating that, right? Because I don't know how to have. I mean, the level of fear is pretty high, and so when she's needed to be scolded or corrected, it always falls on you, because I don't have the skills, right? It's like, and that's not really fair, because usually that's more equal. So it would be nice for me to know how in relationship, sort of the gray areas, right? Like, I can love you and and scold you at the same time, and risk you being angry, you being, by you I mean any person, being angry with me, that I can still exist.
Yeah. I mean, in fairness to Anne, and just to have full disclosure, when she had her miscarriage, really what drove the kind of what drove the distance was I have close to 17 years of being clean and sober, and there was an emotional kind of need, and I was in my disease, right? And I was using and whatever, and Anne didn't know that. And there was this moment when I said, well, I'm kind of using. And that was the moment when she was having the miscarriage. And I mean, she had every right to be mad at me, because I was kind of being selfish and totally self-absorbed and high all the time, and kind of hiding it from her. And here she was at this really vulnerable and very emotional point. And it was emotional for me too, but here I was like, oh, by the way, I'm sorry about your miscarriage, but I'm using, I'm high right now. And she had every right to be pissed at me because I was just being a knucklehead, and being super selfish. It was a trying time for her and for me as well. But she's right. That's when it kind of happened.
But that's such a classic sort of like a situation for an adopted person to get herself in. I mean, I read about this time and time again, is that an adopted person gets involved with someone who has something that keeps them at a distance, right? So these situations, the adoptee sets herself up or himself up to be, quote unquote, deserted, right? Or relinquished or given up. So now I train people around me to say, I love you and I'll never leave. So I mean, early on our first date, when I saw Ryan and I knew he was special to me, I was telling him, there was this moment on our first date where he picked up the newspaper and he started reading it. And I felt like, oh my God, okay. This is relationship, right? Like, I'm not even worthy of breakfast conversation. But the irony was I didn't have anything to say. He picked up the newspaper. I would tap the newspaper and say, hey, I'm adopted. Yeah. So I need a lot of attention.
Right.
And I would walk him through it, because I'm still, I treat it like I have a special parking pass, right? Like, I'm adopted means something, and it means I have special needs. And I know that people argue with that, but I feel like I do have special needs. And I do need people to tell me I love you and I'll never leave, because my brain is stuck in Groundhog Day, where every day is another opportunity to be relinquished. And so I've learned tools, and one is to not hang out with people who are in active drug use or really drink. Right?
That's a good idea.
Right. But truly, I mean, my second husband, had drug issues. It's compelling when you're an adoptee to have someone who is not reachable. But now those things frighten me, because now I know what presence feels like. Do you know, Haley, when we would go to see Keats play field hockey, Ryan comes from his car and he's carrying 3 chairs. He's got a chair for him, and he's got a chair for me and his wife, and he's got a chair for me. And I think that's the best part of being a divorced adoptee.
Well, I think that you guys are doing divorce really well. So that's sort of my last kind of question around that. How have you navigated coming from this place of hurt and brokenness and anger, to still co-parenting Keats so well and having this relationship where you can be, one of Ryan's son's favorite people, like, it's pretty amazing.
I just blame Anne for everything.
blame you for
Yeah,
everything.
yeah. And that makes everything okay. No, I think really what's made us work is that we actually, like I said from the beginning, if anything good was to come of it, actually got the ball rolling for both of us to try to figure out what happened. And ultimately, if you ask the right questions and you're really honest with yourself, it always leads back to you. And then you have to come to terms with whatever your role was. And I remember there was a moment when Ann and I sat down, and I think our divorce was finalized. Oh no, this was later on. But we sat down, and it was the first time that we ever sat down and really apologized to each other for our part in it. And it was just she and I, and we were sitting actually in your living room. You remember, Ann?
Mhm.
And it was a nice conversation, but we also accepted each other's apologies. And it was a nice moment to know that we trusted and loved each other enough that we were able to kind of move forward in that. And there was kind of this silent agreement that, yeah, we both kind of screwed up and we both owned it. But at the end of the day, we still appreciate each other and love each other for who we are. Right. And that's what I'm most grateful for. I am grateful that she shares a life with my family still, that we're able to co-parent Keats, and that we agree and disagree on a lot of things, but at the end of the day, it's not it doesn't go from 0 to 10 like in a moment's notice. We've learned how to just work with each other and trust each other, really.
Yeah, I that's true because I do trust you, and I think that putting Keats first
Mm,
made it easy for us because it's easy when you put your child's well-being first. There's a lot that just falls
mm,
to the side because you don't have to think about it because it's about her.
mhm.
Is there anything else either of you would like to say about this topic before we do recommended resources?
Hmm. I would say if you are dating an adopted person, get therapy.
Yeah, I think. Well, what I would as someone outside of that, I would say don't, if you really are connected with or you feel like there's a future with somebody, don't be afraid to talk about it. Because the person who loves you wants to understand. And I think part of Ann and I's struggle on both sides, right, is that we never really developed a dialogue or a way in which we could ask each other, what is it that makes you sad?
Mhm.
And for us to actually, both of us sort of, like, we didn't actually know, but because we didn't know, we would always sort of look outward for that. We would blame others. Like, we would have resentments for everybody because we just didn't know how to deal with it. And I think I think every husband and wife should have therapy regardless, because I think most people don't really know how to communicate on an adult level. And especially for men, the sort of the knee jerk instinctual reaction is just go into anger, and anger never solves anything. And that was always my issue, right? When I was being criticized or whatever, I just get angry and just be like, I don't need to listen to this. I'm not going to take responsibility for it. And I think if we were to go to therapy, it would have helped kind of. I just needed to learn how to communicate like an adult.
Well,
Uh,
and I needed to learn. I need what I tell people now when they write to me is I tell them it's okay to claim that being adopted is a full-time job.
mm,
And you need to have a partner where it's okay to talk about it every single day and not feel bad about it, right? Not feel apologetic or like, okay, I should be over this by now. It's like, and then eventually I think maybe you don't have to talk about it, but you need to feel safe enough. But it's very embarrassing because you feel like a little kid, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to bring up being adopted again, even though we talked about it yesterday and every day in the last 10 years. It's because, part of as an adopted person, I just wanted to get over it. And it's embarrassing to show even a spouse just how needy you are, and it can feel really boring. But I think, like Ryan was saying, when you're in it together, you're there to support each other. And I think that is a wonderful gift an adopted person can give their spouse, is saying, I need to talk about this every day. And the nicest thing you could do for me is just hold me and listen.
Yeah. And if they're not willing to do that, then they're probably not the right person for you.
Exactly.
That's so right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, my recommended resource is just that, going to counseling, going to therapy. And I think therapists have just an amazing way of being able to mediate a conversation. So even if you're going there to have one specific conversation on a topic, they can just help the other person really hear what you're saying, because we go in and we have these filters, and however long you've been in relationship for, right? We have all of these things that have been swept under the rug and we've been avoiding and or we've kind of blocked out. And so all of these things kind of put filters over our ears, so that at a certain point your spouse is talking and you're like, well, I'm only hearing through these filters. And a therapist or a psychologist or a counselor, whoever you go and see, they have this amazing way that they can really help the other party hear what you really need them to understand. In the season 4 preview, the bonus episode I did with my husband, we talked about how when I was in reunion, one of the things that we did was we did go to counseling together because it put such a strain on our relationship. And I'm very fortunate. My husband is a very, stable guy, super healthy and emotionally, and I'm just not. And so he came with me to see my therapist, and it was amazing. Like it was such a good intervention for us. And I think that was, indeed at an earlier point, before these things started to pile up too much. So I really appreciated the several times that you both talked about the importance of it and going sooner rather than later. You can just go for a tune-up. You don't have to let things go for too long. And there's no shame in it. It's just a totally normal thing. And so I really encourage you, like don't be scared of it. There's nothing scary happens in the therapist's office. Except the bill. The bill at the end could be scary, but that's maybe the only scary thing. Okay, so Anne, what did you want to recommend to us?
I am recommending something a little bit different because I was thinking about tension. And so there's this book I use. It's called The Role Model. It's ROLL, and it's by Jill Miller. And it's reading from the cover. It's a step-by-step guide to erase pain, improve mobility, and live better in your body. And it's a way you can self-massage using these tune-up balls that Jill Miller has. And it's wonderful. And I think that when you are stressed, sometimes you can get way too much in your head. And it's not a bad thing to take a few minutes and to address the tension in your body and see maybe if some of your anger isn't just muscular. So I would suggest that.
Well, we've talked so much, like different episodes of the show, right? About how trauma is stored in your body. And that's awesome. What an awesome resource.
Start crying, right? You work your quads, you start crying, and suddenly you're not angry at your husband anymore.
Yeah. Perfect. It's so much cheaper than therapy also.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ryan, I'm going to put you on the spot now because I didn't ask you ahead of time. Do you have anything that you'd want to recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm speaking from sort of the spousal side that's not adopted, I would just say to the spouse that's not adopted, don't be afraid to ask and don't be afraid to communicate and try to understand or be open to listening and acknowledging kind of the sort of the sadness and the reticence that we've talked about, because I think so many times I wanted to, but I just didn't, because I just wasn't sure how to approach it. And I think as opposed to not doing it. I should have just dove in and tried to really invest in understanding what Anne was going through.
Thank you. I just want to say a gigantic thank you to each of you. I felt like this whole conversation was sort of sacred territory. So just thank you for inviting us in to this conversation and being so open. Just an honor to hear you both share your perspectives.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, Ryan, can you tell us how we can connect with you online if we would like to express our gratitude for sharing?
I think Facebook is the easiest place. I'm not. I used to have a Twitter handle, but I just never used it, so I closed my account. So I'm just Ryan Iwanaga on Facebook.
Perfect. And Anne, where can we find you online?
I'm also on Facebook, and I have a secret page for adoptees only. If anyone wants me to add them, it's a sweet group. Just let me know. And I have a blog at annheffron.com and Twitter at Anne Heffron and Instagram, etc. I think that's everything.
And if we would like to do a write or die class with you, at the time of this recording, we have planned for May in San Francisco. So we're going to be doing that together in person. I'm so excited. Oh.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. And so if people go to my blog, they can read it and they can just type in write or die. They can look for the classes. And then also I have the Adoptee Healing Retreat with Pam Cardano. And we got that also on the blog, so they could just type in Adoptee Healing Retreat.
Yes, so many awesome things. Well, thanks again, Ryan and Anne. Just an honor to hear your story. I would love it if you would head to San Francisco and meet up with me and Anne to do the Write or Die class. We are meeting on May 20th. That's a Sunday afternoon, as well as we have a listener meetup later on in the evening. So you're welcome to come to one or both of those events. The details are on adopteeson.com/events, as well as on our Facebook page on the events tab. I would love to meet you in real life. Come and learn about writing from Anne. I think it's going to be a really, really special day. I'm very, very excited about it. I want to just extend my great thanks once again to my supporters that partner with me every single month to help keep bringing you this podcast. If you're interested in keeping the show going, if you find the content valuable, please consider partnering with me. Adopteeson.com/partner has the details of how you can sign up to be a monthly Patreon of the show. There is a secret Facebook group for adoptees only as a special perk. And at different levels of support, there's also a secret podcast feed for unedited episodes of the show that I do with Carrie Cahill Mulligan and some other special guests from time to time. So again, it's adopteeson.com/partner if you'd like to check out more details for supporting the show. Thank you. Last favor to ask before we say goodbye until next week. Would you consider sharing the show today with just one person? Maybe you have a friend that's adopted that is struggling in relationship. If you shared the show with them, would it be an encouragement to them that they're not alone, and maybe they would get some good advice about how to talk to their spouse about some of the feelings that they're going through? Thank you for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.